here, are able to see her. So hello everyone, and welcome to Mayan's class here, pre-Pesach class with Rachel Danziger. Where is Moshe? We are very curious where he is, and we're looking forward to having Rachel teach for us again, and enjoy the comfort of your home as you listen to Rachel.
Thank you, Ilana. This is my very first Zoom lesson, so yeah, we'll see how it goes. Thank you. I'm really excited to see or not see, depends whom, but it's nice that you're all here. It's nice to feel that we're together even while we're all apart. Kind of like in the very first Pesach, when each family sat in its own home waiting for Malach HaMavet to pass, to skip, for death to skip over their homes, becoming a nation even as they gathered to just be with their own families. So I feel like we're entering that stage again. So let's get to it. Ilana mentioned that she's curious to know where Moshe is. Well, I'm happy to say that my 2-year-old son knows where Moshe is. He knows that Moshe is in the bathroom. And at the end of the class, please remind me to explain how he got to this conclusion. But we have a while before that. So I'll start by saying that when it became clear that we will not be able to be during Passover with our family, with our extended family, we decided to create a family Haggadah. Each of us got a different segment of the text, each of us illustrated it, and we're gathering it all together so that all the different families we're part of can have this copy during the Seder. And when I asked my children which parts they want to illustrate, sorry, do people hear me? Can you just raise your hand if you hear me? Okay, great, just making sure. So when I asked my kids which of the Haggadah segments they want to illustrate, both my son and my daughter immediately said that they want to illustrate the part about baby Moses on the river, which of course does not appear in the Haggadah at all. So that caused a lot of consternation and a lot of hurt feelings on behalf of Moshe, who after all took us out of Egypt, and how can we just, push him out of the story like that in this kind of cruel way. And that's kind of what motivated me to choose this particular topic today and to ask, where is Moshe? Why isn't Moshe there in the flesh? Why isn't he part of the story of redemption as told in the Haggadah? And is he still present there in some other ways? One popular, common, whatever you want to call it, answer to the question why Moshe isn't mentioned by name, except one mention, which we will get to in a second, is that the story of the Haggadah is trying to impress upon us that our redemption, our freedom, the fact that we and our parents and our children are all free people and part of a nation are all due to God. And in order not to distract us from the centrality of God, they decentralized Moshe. They withdrew Moshe from the story. The truth is, it makes a lot of sense because God is so grand and so impersonal that if there are human heroes in the story, it will be much easier to relate to them. Let's be honest with ourselves. We would all want to illustrate the baby on the river and not God saving people with his great open hand, whatever that means. So one fact that seems to, sorry, just a moment. One fact that seems to support this, as you can see in the source sheet in the first box, the only time that Moshe is in fact mentioned in the Haggadah, he is only mentioned as God's slave. And it's when Rabbi Yosef Glili asks, from where can you derive that the Egyptians were struck with 10 plagues in Egypt and struck with 50 plagues at the sea? In Egypt, what does it state? Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And at the sea, what does it state? And Israel saw the Lord's great hand that he used upon the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in Moshe, his servant. And therefore, finger, hand, you get the picture. Point is, this is the only place Moshe actually appears by name in the Haggadah, almost as if the Haggadah wanted to make sure that we see that Moshe is only God's slave and not his own protagonist. But of course, even though Moshe, the man, doesn't appear in the Haggadah beyond that, he is present in a very real way. He is present through his words. Much of the Haggadah is quoting various passages by Moshe, various words that Moshe said in different places in Chameshet Chumshei Torah. And in fact, when you read through the Haggadah carefully and look at the references and try and see which text come from where, it's almost as if Moshe is speaking to us through the story constantly. But the question is, in what role do his words appear? And it's not always in the most flattering of roles or in the most central of roles. For example, if you look at the second box in your source sheet, you'll see one of the first places where we really encounter Moshe's words. And it's at the part where Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah talks about whether we're supposed to speak about the redemption from Egypt, remember the redemption from Egypt during the day or also during the night. And he says, as you see in the source before you, "Behold, I am like a man of 70 years, and I have not merited to understand why the exodus from Egypt should be said at night, until Ben Zoma explicated it, as it is stated, in order that you remember the day of your going out from the land of Egypt, all the days of your life." The days of your life indicates a remembrance being invoked during the days. All the days of your life during the night. The words, "in order that you remember the day of your going out from the land of Egypt, all the days of your life, leman tizkor et yom tzetcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha," are a direct quote from something Moshe told us in Deuteronomy when he told us to celebrate Pesach. And he told us, I'm looking at Deuteronomy 16, 1-8, still in the second box. At the bottom, he says, let's read just the third verse. "You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter you shall eat unleavened bread, bread of distress, for you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live." Great. So Moshe appears in the Haggadah. We have his words here, except that his words are not even given to us directly as a quote from him. They're only given to us as something that other people are using when they are creating reality. The Chachamim are sitting and debating how we're supposed to celebrate, how we're supposed to remember the Exodus, and they use these words without even saying, "Oh, Moshe said." They just take them and argue about how to interpret them. And this is a very interesting moment. It's a very interesting interpretive act, because the Chachamim, on the one hand, grant a lot of authority and power to Moshe. His words are the authoritative words that they need to make their opinion align with. They need to show that their opinion can align with what Moshe said. In other words, if Ben Zoma wants people to remember the Exodus at night, he needs to show a source in Moshe's words for it. But at the same time, even in the very act when they give Moshe this central place as their source of authority, they also take initiative or take agency into their own hands. They give us Moshe's words, but mediate it through their concerns and their interests and what they're trying to create in the world. So even though we can see that Moshe's words are present, it's hard to say that Moshe is really present in the Haggadah if all we get is this diluted kind of textual remnants of Moshe's words that's passed through us, through the mediation of other people talking about the various things. But of course, there are other places in the Haggadah where Moshe is quoted more directly and more fully. And I'm talking for now about the text of the 4 sons. Let's focus for a second on the evil son, on the evil son, the innocent son, and the son who cannot ask, as you can see on the screen and on the page. The evil son says, "What is this worship to you? Ma ha'avodah azot lachem?" These are words that are quoted from Exodus 12:26. to you and not to him. And since he excluded himself from the collective, he denied a principle of the Jewish faith. And accordingly, you will blunt his teeth and say to him, and once again, we see a quote from Exodus, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt? I'm not going to go into the details of each son. I assume that we all either saw it or will see it very shortly in the text. I'm more interested in how these parts of the Haggadah use Moshe's words. So we already see that in the evil son, he uses two quotes, a question and an answer, that actually are part of two different chapters. If you look down at the innocent son, his question and answer are taken from one verse in chapter 13 of Exodus. He's asking, Mazot, what is this? And the answer is, with the strength of his hand did the Lord take us from Egypt, from the house of slaves. And the one who cannot ask, who doesn't know how to ask, we tell him, we open the story to him, as it is stated, and you will speak to your son on that day, saying, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt? All these three texts borrow from two accounts that are given to the people in Parashat Bo in Exodus. One of those accounts are given to them before the last Makkah, as Moshe prepares them for it, as he tells them to take the blood and put it on their doorposts and not leave their houses and sacrifice the Passover and eat it overnight and wait for God's redemption. And the second account in Exodus 13 is given to them immediately after the redemption from Egypt, after they are told by Pharaoh to leave, when Moshe tells them how they should remember, understand, incorporate this day and what just happened to them into their future. There are some commentators who hold that the second account is out of place, but really it was given in Sinai, and the reason that it's taken out of the account in Sinai and put here is just because the topic of the Exodus from Egypt is here in Bo, and that's where it should be discussed. But regardless of when the Israelites actually received this account by Moshe and the particular mitzvot that come with it, in particular, if you look at the second quote, the second part of box 5, you will see that the account Moshe gives them is part of telling them that they have to sanctify all the firstborn to God. And, sorry, just a second, realigning here with the technology. And it's just very odd to talk to a blinking light and pretend that it's actually you all in the flesh, and not find myself looking at your pictures instead. So I'm trying to focus. Regardless of when God actually told this to the people through Moshe, it's important that the story of the Exodus includes these stories here, and in a sense sandwiches the actual event of the Exodus with an account before it explaining us what to expect, and an account after it telling us what to take from it. It's very modern, in a sense, to treat educational events this way. Tell them what to expect, tell them what to take from it, hope they get something out of it all. Another interesting fact, though, is that in both of these accounts, the one that comes before the Exodus, the top one in this box ahead of you, and the one that comes after it, Moshe is talking to the people about some distant future. Let's look for a second at the first source here, Exodus 12. Let's just read through it. Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go, pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. And when you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children ask you, 'What do you mean by this rite?' you shall say, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but saved their houses.'" At this moment, when the Israelites are still handling the anxiety and the fear of the unknown, of waiting for this last plague to hit, of waiting to find out, are we going to die? Are we going to go out? Will it work this time? All the other plagues didn't actually achieve their goal, at least from their perspective. At that moment, Moshe is already talking to them, not merely about the tomorrow, pack your bags or something like that. He tells them, one day down the line, your kids will ask you, why do you celebrate this way? And you'll say, because we remember this event that happened that didn't actually happen yet. So I want to pause here for a second and just point out that in a sense, Moshe is being extremely reassuring, because what he's implying to the Israelites here is this utter confidence that redemption will come. And perhaps they found it to be an anchor in this moment of great unknowns. I wish somebody could tell me, one day you will remember this time of Corona by doing this and that. I wish somebody could tell that to me with assurance. I would feel much better, frankly. The other interesting thing about these two passages, the one from Exodus 12 and the one from Exodus 13, is that the person who tells the Israelites here how to tell their children the story of the Exodus is not God, it's Moshe. Both of these parts, both of these accounts are preceded in the actual text of the book Exodus, of Shemot, by God giving certain instructions to Moshe. In other words, God tells Moshe, tell the Israelites how to bring this offering now and prepare for the plague, and that they will celebrate Passover to remember it. God tells it to Moshe, and then Moshe retells it. But if you look at box 6 and see God's version, which we just read in Parshat HaChodesh, not in Shul, probably for most of us, God doesn't say anything about telling the story. He talks about how it shall be a day of remembrance. He talks about how we shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout the ages, and an institution, and what we will eat and what we will do. But there's nothing here about our children asking us questions and us answering them. The same is true for the account in chapter 13. If you look again at what Moshe is saying to the Israelites after the fact of the Exodus, the parts that are in bold, he says, I'll start in verse 8. And you shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I am free from Egypt. And this shall serve you as a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. And let's go down to verse 14. And when in time to come your son asks you, saying, what does this mean? You shall say to him, it was with a mighty hand that the Lord brought us out from Egypt, the house of bondage. When you look at the words that God told Moshe before Moshe went on to instruct the people, let's look at here at Exodus 13, 1-2. The Lord spoke further to Moshe, saying, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast, the first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. And somehow from this very succinct instruction, Moshe turns it into this long explanation of how one day after they already make it into their land, they should tell the story to their children. They should encourage their children to ask questions. They should bring the Exodus, the event that they just experienced, that they're freshly feeling at that moment that Moshe is talking to them, even if it's in Sinai, it's still pretty fresh. You, the people, he tells them, will have to take all of this and turn it into part of your relationship with your children. I think it's worth noting that it's not God who talks to us about storytelling, but rather Moshe. And I think that the fact that the Chumash does it this way, that it doesn't tell us exactly, that it leaves, I'll put it differently, maybe God did tell Moshe that, but the Chumash doesn't quote God as saying that. The Chumash makes a point of putting these words, the words about sharing the story, in the human mouth of Moshe. These facts, this fact that it's Moshe who says it, is significant. Because the truth is that storytelling as a way to absorb, appropriate, work through, understand reality and eventually make it part of us by giving it certain meaning and placing it somewhere within us, within our memory, within our mind, within our mapping of the world, it's a uniquely human attribute. It's something that gives us enormous advantages over other creatures on Earth. It's something that allows us to pass warnings, ideas, art from generation to generation. And it's also something that is uniquely suited to the fact that, unlike God, we are subjective, somewhat blind, stuck in certain circumstances and therefore in certain perspective creatures. Because storytelling is never objective. Storytelling never gives you the truth and nothing but the truth. Storytelling can never give you a true account that you can then rely on as evidence to construct a true representation of reality. Because it's always told by someone and to someone and in certain circumstances. It's always limited by our perspective. It's always limited by our relationship. There's certain things that I won't include in a story to my children, even though I might include it in a story to people like you, for example. It's always limited by what we know at a particular moment in time. It could be that the stories I tell my kids now about the world around me and its madness will be extremely different in 2 weeks, in a year. God willing, we will be here and still be telling stories about it. So when the Torah gives the role of storytelling instructor to Moshe, it's also telling us that Moshe, being human himself, understands that in order to be part of our life, the Exodus has to be passed on in this medium that's uniquely human. It needs to be passed on in a way that will allow it to become part of the human experience, even though that means that it will be distorted by people's perspective, even if it means that it'll be subjective, even it'll mean that in every generation we will tell the story in different ways. This is the way that it has to pass for people to relate to it and find meaning within it. I would like to hear what Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg has to say about it in her book, The Particulars of Rapture, an amazing book about Exodus. If the purpose of the plagues is to become narrative, and here she refers to the fact that Moshe tells them how to tell the story before the last plague even takes place. This will not be a mere transcription of the manifest power of God observed by all, Egyptians and Israelites alike. It'll be a self-conscious account, personal to each father-son diet, of the unfolding conflicts generated by memory. Telling will be performative, a mode of access to meanings beyond one's means. In other words, through the telling, through those moments of creation of a story, through our saviors down the generations, we're not merely retelling what happened, we are creating our own version of it that means something and is somehow alive to us. And Rabbi Sachs, in this quote below, that I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but I highly recommend reading it and reading the entire article it's taken from, calls this particular way of commemorating the Exodus, the way that goes beyond just bringing a certain sacrifice and eating certain food and having a certain festival that lasts a certain amount of days, which is what we see in God's version, but rather turning it into a storytelling event. This, as Rabbi Sachs says, is Moshe's genius. And it's genius because he understands that this is what makes people feel connected to each other. This is his unique gift to us. With that understanding in mind, let's go back to our original question, which was, after all, where is Moshe in the Haggadah? How is he present in the Haggadah? We saw before that when the Chachamim quote, when the sages quote Moshe in the middle of discussing halacha, it's both attributing authority to Moshe, but also kind of removing his words from his mouth. It's not really making Moshe present for us. I'll give you a different example. If I quote Shakespeare now, what's in a name? Does that make Shakespeare present in our conversation, in our Zoom call? No. I'm just using it for my own purposes. But when we read Moshe's instructions on how to tell the story, when we understand that he gave us this gift, and we understand it as we are telling the story sitting around the table during the Seder, I think that Moshe is more present. I think that in a sense, it's almost as if Moshe is talking to us directly, telling us, do this. And we're reading his instructions and then doing it. We are reading them as they're worked into the evil son's words, the innocent son's words, and our answer to the son who doesn't know how to ask. But really, we're turning the gift that Moshe gave us, the gift of having to tell the story in a certain way, into part of our relationship with our actual children, with our actual family, and with ourselves. But interestingly, the wise son in the story asks on from those moments during Exodus, right before or right after redemption. The wise son's question comes from a totally different time. It comes from, oh, can everybody see me? I'm getting some feedback from the internet. The wise son's question comes from 3 books later, from Deuteronomy, from Chumash Dvarim, and 40 years later, from the last days of Moshe's life, when he is talking not to the generation that lived through the Exodus, but rather to a new generation that grew up in the desert. And if we look at the text here, sorry, just a moment. If we look at the text from the Haggadah here at the top of box 8, what does the wise son say? What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you? And these words are taken from chapter 6 in Deuteronomy that tells us, if we look below, when, in time to come, your children ask you, what mean the decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your children. And now the answer in the Haggadah, of course, is not this answer, but it's worthwhile to see what Moshe actually tells us to say. Sorry. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. And us he freed from there, and that he might take us to give us the land that he has promised an oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. It'll be therefore to our merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction as he has commanded us. I want to ask you for a second, Ilana, can we do that? Can we ask a question and receive answers?
Yeah, and people can unmute themselves and just hopefully not everyone answers at exactly this exact same moment.
Maybe people can raise their hands, or I don't know.
I think it's hard. A lot of people have their video off, so we'll just try, and you're all adults who are polite, so we'll take turns.
Okay, so I want to ask, in your opinion, when Moshe says these words to this generation, what is he trying to achieve? Why is it important to him to remind them that they must tell the story at this particular moment in history? After all, they're not the ones who actually experienced it. He tells them to tell the story as if they experienced it, but they did not. Why does he want them to tell it this way? Any thoughts?
They're at a crucial step where they're about to end, the next stage will happen. And it's like at each stage, you have to recapitulate what came before. So if this is the end of Moshe's life, and he's kind of handing them over, and getting to the land is a lot closer, you still have to tie it to the back part, or to the history.
If I understand correctly, Susanna, I think that you're saying two things, actually. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying, one, that it's a moment of transition, and any moment of transition requires an act of reaffirming. And we will see that later. We will see that Yehoshua, for example, when they enter the land and then before he dies, does something similar, retelling the story and telling them to carry it forward. And you're also saying that in particular, in this moment when they're about to go into the land, it's important. And I would like to ask you or anybody else who would like to elaborate on that, why is it important in particular at this moment before going into Israel?
They'll have
Yes.
the next Pesach.
I'm sorry?
They will be able at that point to have the next Pesach.
Yeah, so part of it is halachic, that now they're going to be able to have the full Pesach. Does anybody want to add? Yes, Deborah.
Rav Moshe Tzvineria says that, points out, looking at Moshe as a father, his sons were of the generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but they did not leave Mitzrayim. They were back in Midian with Sipporah. So this next generation can represent to Moshe what his children would have represented to him in terms of, this was my experience, and I want you to have this experience since I will not be moving forward with you. It's like a tzavah. It's like a living will, in a sense.
It's particularly poignant, I think. What you're saying is particular, in a moment, Andrea. I think what you're saying is particularly poignant, seeing that Moshe suffered so much handling the people in the desert and elsewhere. And he even talked about it at some point. I don't remember exactly where. And he said, like, it's not as if I had a womb to birth you and still I have to deal with all these problems and all these issues. He really is kind of adopting a paternal position. Andrea, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, as the story's unfolding, it's consistently made clear by God and Moshe that the exodus from Egypt's endpoint is entering Israel. And it was supposed to be the same generation. It was supposed to be the same people. So to enter Israel, not putting on that generation as if they were the generation who left, is to, in some ways, not disconnect the taking of Israel from the experience in Egypt, but also to nullify the point of the Exodus to begin with. Because if the people who left didn't make it to Israel, it calls into question the entire project. So even we're who, came the same, the circumcising of the males and the getting ready for the Passover Seder for those men who didn't actually leave Egypt, it seems essential that they metaphorically left Egypt.
If I understand correctly what you're saying, correct me if I'm misrepresenting it, please. You're saying that Moshe here is performing surgery, in a sense. He needs to patch or bridge over a certain wound that was created when, through their own sinfulness and through their own inability to rise to the occasion, the Israelites created this divide where the generation that experiences the Exodus and the generation that experiences the end point of the Exodus are not the same generation. And it creates this kind of chasm within this one narrative that was supposed to be one glorious, victorious march from slavery to freedom to meaning to nationhood. So through the power of storytelling, he's kind of creating a fictive self for the next generation so that they could be almost 1.5, generation 1.5, and not second generation. Something along these lines?
Ooh, I like that. Sure, yes.
You'll take it.
I'll take it.
Anybody else wants to add anything? Any thoughts? Any questions before we move on? Okay, so let's go back to the text a moment. Here. I think that I liked all of your answers, and I think that it is a moment of transition, and it's also a moment of profound transition because it brings to completion the narrative of the Exodus. It brings to completion the miracle of the Exodus. Just a minute, can I ask everybody to make sure they're muted, just because I'm getting some feedback? Okay, I'm gonna keep talking now. And yet I think there's another element in the transition from the desert to the land that's particularly troubling Moshe, or perhaps I should say is on his mind. And the clue for it lies in this text that we just read, the text from Deuteronomy 6, 20 to 25, right here in front of you. At least I hope it's in front of you. It should be in front of you. I have no idea if it's actually working. In box number 8, the second source. Note that the kind of story that Moshe wants us to tell our children when they ask us why we follow God's laws ties several things together. It ties our obedience to the laws, which is the fact we're trying to explain to our children, with the fact that we were slaves and we were freed by God, with the fact that God gave us the land. If you look at verse 23, and us he freed from there, that he might take us and give us the land that he has promised on oath to our fathers, and also to our current and future survival in the land. In other words, he is trying to create a story that will create in people's mind this dependence between our state of freedom, our state of prosperity, our gratitude to God, and following God's words. And in here we hear an undertone of warning, because what it's really telling us is that if we forget, if we stop obeying God, then our freedom, our survival, our presence in the land of Israel will be lost to us, as Deuteronomy states clearly in other places. In fact, it's almost the theme of Deuteronomy that Moshe constantly warns us. If you follow the laws, you will prosper in the land. If you don't follow, you will be exiled and you will be lost. And perhaps by creating this story for them to tell, Moshe is trying to guarantee that they will in fact continue to obey God. Because Moshe is about to die, and he will no longer be able to guide them as they go into the land. And as they go into the land, it's not another transition. It's a moment when, instead of being dependent on God for food, for their itinerary, for the timetable of their travel, for anything really, they're about to have to take matters into their own hands, fight their own wars, sow their own fields, solve their own neighborly disputes, deal with their own Masechet Nezikin issues, if you want to put it this way, with their own enemies. And as we will see in the following books in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, and from Yeshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, those were not easy tasks for them to handle, and they failed as often as they succeeded. And as Moshe leaves them on the brink of this era, he must be worried that this utter change in their reality will make them forget what came before that, and forget that the only reason they even made it this far was because God brought them there. So he wants them to keep telling a story, and I think the telling is no less important than the hearing the story, because the creativity, the part where they invest themselves into it, happens when you tell the story, not when you just listen to it as a passive audience. He wants them to keep telling the story of how everything they have is really thanks to God, and therefore it's worthwhile remaining faithful to God. In fact, towards the end of Deuteronomy, Moshe asks the people to do exactly that, to remember that God gave them the land whenever they whenever they can collect fruits from the trees of the land. If we go down to the, not the next source, but the bottom source in this box, Deuteronomy 26, 1 to 11, this is what's called in Hebrew, Mikra Bikurim, the declarations of the first fruit. God tells the people, Moshe tells the people, when your trees bear fruit, take the fruit, bring it to the priest, bring it to Jerusalem, and then say the following text. And it is in bold in the source for you. I'll read straight from there. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, O Lord, have given me. You shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God, etc., etc. In other words, Moshe is not just leaving it in our hands. It's not just telling us, oh, when your kids happen to ask you this question about the laws, explain to them that it's because we're grateful to God for freeing us from Egypt and giving us the land. No. And by the way, sorry, I'm going to rewind for a second. The fact that we say we're grateful that he took us from Egypt and brought us to the land, I think aligns very nicely with your idea, Andrea, that he's creating here a narrative that's complete. That even though each of the generations that were part of this process only lived half of it, he's creating a narrative that puts it all as one action, one long process that they can, through osmosis, through the act of storytelling, experience for themselves as one, as a unified process indeed. Sorry. But he's not just counting on their kids to ask the right questions so that they would tell the story. He also, through God's instructions, following God's instructions, no doubt, gives them opportunities and occasions that are ritualized, that are institutionalized, that come every year, that everybody does, or there's social pressure to do them too, that are part of your culture, not just, a personal relationship with your kids, to tell the story, and through the power of the story, to connect again those ideas of freedom from Egypt, of the land, and therefore we follow the orders, and as long as we continue to follow God's orders and commandments, all will be well. As an aside, I want to say that the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig had a very interesting comment about the word mitzvah, the word commandment. He said that it's very fitting that the word Jews use for laws is not chok, law. It's not constitution, because laws and constitutions are impersonal. Somebody writes a constitution, and the whole point of a constitution is that it's not personal, that it stands there and it's outside the relationship between people. It's outside the questions like who's in power now, who gets to decide what. It just stands there and it's impersonal and it's above everybody. But this is not what Judaism is about. Judaism is not about having a constitution that we follow. It's about having a relationship with God. And the word mitzvah, the word commandment, comes from the verb mitzaveh, commands. It's a very active word. It's a word that assumes a relationship. Mitzvah only has power as long as whoever is mitzaveh is still uttering it. So when we say we follow mitzvot, we try and live by the mitzvot, what we're saying is we're living in a constant relationship with God. And it's perhaps this kind of sense of being in a relationship that Moshe is trying to embed in our consciousness through these stories that he wants us to tell. Interestingly, Moshe doesn't merely tell us to tell these stories. And he doesn't merely tell us to engage in them with regularity. The first person to actually do that, to actually look at the Exodus in some retrospect and share the story of what happened and make it personal, in the sense that it's not just a story of this is the facts, but rather this is how we felt, this is how I felt, this is what I thought, this is what I did. The first person to do that in the Chumash, any guesses who it is? Anyone? Who is the first person to tell the story of the Exodus as a personal account? I'll give you a hint. It's in Deuteronomy. It's Moshe.
Moshe.
Yeah, exactly.
Moshe.
It's Moshe himself. Moshe himself, yeah, let's put it this way, yeah. He does what he tells us to do. If we look at the page again, it's a source sheet. If we look at box number 10, sorry, no, not number 10, number 11. Let's look at the second source, Deuteronomy 1, 6-13. Moshe starts telling, Moshe is about to die, as we said. He's about to leave the people to their fate. He's about to leave them to handle everything that comes from self-determination and sovereignty and all these challenges that come ahead. And before his death, he collects them. He calls them to stand before him. And he speaks dvarim, words, things to them. And this is what he actually says. The Lord our God spoke to us at Chorev, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arava, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the seacoast, the line of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I place the land at your disposal. Go take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to assign to them and to their heirs after them. Thereupon I said to you, and he's speaking in the first person. It's Moshe's story about his experience. And he's also speaking in the second person. He speaks to them as if they were the generation who was there in Sinai, even though they were not. I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear unaided the travel of you and the burdens and the bickering? Pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. I would like to ask you a question once more. In what ways does this passage, we're looking at this passage in Moshe's voice. In what way can we tell, how can we tell that this is not just, a repetition of Shemot? In what way can we tell that this is his personal account of his personal experience, beyond the fact that he says, that we're told that he's the one saying that? Any thoughts? I'll put it differently. Does it actually repeat fact to fact what we remember from Exodus, or does it differ from what we saw before?
It's much more his personal telling.
Mm-hmm.
It's his experience of it. It's his personal experience much more than, it's not the story we tell in the Haggadah, or that's not the story that we are commanded to tell our children. That's his version of what happened. So it's a much more personal story about his role, and maybe that's kind of modeling for us how to tell the story, that it is, we're telling a story, but it needs to come from us, to have our own overlay on it, of our own experience,
our own emotional truths also. He's talking here about his emotional truth, what he felt.
Right.
Yes,
I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly, but I think when Moshe originally said that, he didn't say it to the people, he said it to God, which means he'd be letting the people in now on his private conversation with God in this retelling. I don't recall him actually saying those words to the people at the time. Certainly in order. It's a mix-up of several different things.
Yeah. Also the same is true of what he tells them about how he decided that they need to have more officers, more officials. Do you remember who told him to do that in Exodus?
Yitro.
That was
Exactly.
Yitro. I mean,
exactly. Here he talks from his own experience, how he sees it. Also, do you remember why Yitro made that advice? What motivated Yitro at the time?
The long
Anybody remember?
lines to reach Moshe.
Exactly. Yitro's point was that the people are suffering. This is not good for the people. The people need a more efficient system in place. They can't stand in these lines. Imagine today if we had to stand in such lines with 6 feet between us as well. That would be interesting.
But it's also interesting how he harkens back to the promise of being as numerous as the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And first he takes it as like, oy vey, I got all these people, they're as numerous as the stars. He's at the one point both using it as a positive, because then he goes on to say, you should be more, but he's also saying, this is too much for me. He's using the language of the promise, which we haven't seen quite before, because he's harking all the way back to Avraham. And he's bringing Avraham back into the story and the promise that Hashem gave to Avraham. But he's saying, like in reality, all these people, as many as stars, you should have more, but it's too much for me.
I think that's a very beautiful point, that Moshe is not just telling his story. It's in his, sometimes we talk about storyscape, like the landscape of the story. The way Moshe carves and shapes the landscape of his own story, he already works it into the broader storyscape of the entire Jewish history. He goes all the way back, not to Exodus, he goes all the way back to Genesis, to the original promise that brought the Jews here to the land at this point, eventually. That's a very beautiful point. Thank you for sharing it, Susanna. Somewhat of a follow-up question, in a sense. Why do you think he starts a story at this point? The place where we start a story matters. It kind of shapes the expectations of the listeners as regarding where it's going to go now, and it means something for our experience as storytellers and as listeners. So why is it starting here and not when I was a child in Egypt or when we came out of Egypt? Why is it starting in Chorev and furthermore, not even before Ma'amad Har Sinai, but after? Why is it starting there, in your opinion? Anyone? Well, let's just leave it as something to think about moving forward, and let's go back to the text then. Moment here. I want to point out another aspect that I find is very interesting here. We said before in the very, very beginning of our class, speaking of the places where you begin things, we said before that Moshe is not in the Haggadah. This is kind of the background fact of this conversation we're having here. But the truth is that before Moshe was removed from the Haggadah by its compilers, Moshe took steps to remove himself from the national story. Because if you look here at this very personal moment where he shares his own narrative of his experience and his feelings, sorry, and how overwhelmed he himself personally felt, in this very moment, he doesn't start by saying I. Mm-hmm. He says, the Lord our God spoke to us, saying you, and you in Hebrew here is in the plural. So he's telling a story that's a story of a group. And he goes on and on and on talking in this plural. And there's one singular God, and there's the plural of us or of atem, the plural you, that's the people, and he is part of them. And where does he say I? Where does he put himself in the story? In verse 9, in the very verse where he says, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, etc., pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. In other words, the moment where he puts himself in the singular in the middle of the story is the point where he basically tells them, that was when I withdrew from sole leadership of the people. the way Moshe crafts a story is not focused on his I, even though he shares it from his perspective. It's focused on the creation of this collective we. And perhaps part of what he's trying to give the Israelites as he's about to die and they're about to enter this totally new reality is to try and give them a story where he's not the hero, where they are the protagonist as a group. Because if Moshe is the protagonist of the Exodus, and that's the story we keep telling every generation, then at the first sight of trouble in the promised land, how are we supposed to handle it? We don't have Moshe. Just as Moshe's body is lost to us, Moshe's presence in the story is lost to us. And by doing that, it frees us to carve our own stories and create our own fate. But absent or not, I feel that by leaving his words for us, Moshe is still with us. As I said before, when we tell the story in the way he told us to tell it, it's as if we're responding to his call. It's as if he's there telling us what to do and we do it. But when we see that he doesn't only tell us what to do, but he is also the first that actually does it. He's the first who looks at the Exodus and instead of sharing it as factual account, share it as his own personal account that's adapted to the needs of his circumstances and his generation, or the generation he's speaking to at any rate. When we see that he is the first to do that, and then we do that as well, we're not merely doing what Moshe told us to do. We're not merely following the mitzvah, the commandment, and thus keep him with us by being in a relationship with what he told us to do. We're also following in his footsteps. We're also modeling ourselves, in a sense, after him. And so if we started this class with a question, where is Moshe in the Haggadah? And we said, oh, his words are quoted here, and we follow his commandment there. The point I want to really finish with, and we're not finishing yet, but the point where I think it all converges for me is that Moshe is in the Haggadah because he's within us. Because when we tell the story following in his footsteps, we're bringing him into the Haggadah with ourselves, within ourselves. Let's take a step back for a second. This sounds kind of grand and odd and somewhat unsubstantiated at this point. So let's take a step back for a second and consider what it means. Much of the Haggadah, and we focused on these particularly chosen parts from the Haggadah, but when we look at it in its entirety, much of the Haggadah is really texts about people talking about the Exodus. From those 5 wise men who are sitting in Bnei Brak discussing the Exodus, to the different rabbis, kind of how does it go, this expression, one-upmanship, one-upmanning each other and trying to come up with hermeneutical explanations for why we got more and more, why the Egyptians suffered from more and more and more and more and more plagues on the sea than they did in actual Egypt, by kind of quoting different verses and interpreting them in playful ways. And then we have those fictional conversations between 4 types of sons and 4 parents that take parts from the biblical story but turn them into this fictive situations, these kind of archetypical situations that sometimes match reality, sometimes not, sometimes feel very alienating, and so on and so forth. The entire Haggadah is constantly people talking about the Exodus. One of the more ancient parts, and I didn't bring this quote due to the shortness of the time, one of the important parts of the Haggadah is the part where we talk about how mitchila ovdei avodah zara ayu avotenu. And this part quotes a speech that Yehoshua gave at the end of his life, where he told the people, in the beginning we were idol worshippers, then God brought us to the knowledge of the truth and saved us and brought us here, And the question is now, will you continue following him or not? And the people say, yes, yes, we will follow God, we will be with God. And Yeshua creates a new covenant and dies. And in doing so, in using those last moments of his life to use storytelling to recovenant the people and recommit them to their path, he is modeling himself after Moshe. And later, when the rabbis are sitting around a table in Bnei Brak with the rebellion against the Romans looming in the background, about to happen, and we, the readers, already know the tragedy that is to come. When they're sitting there talking and talking and talking to the point that their students have to come and tell them, come on, it's time for Kriyat Shema Shachrit, they're modeling themselves after Moshe and after Yeshua. And when Rabbi Yosef Aglili tries to come up with a way to make it so that there's a lot of different makot on the sea, he is modeling himself after Moshe and after Yeshua and after all the rabbis and the leaders that came before him. And when we sit at the Seder table and read all those different accounts, we're joining this intergenerational journey of telling the story and reshaping it and making it express and fit whatever our concerns are. We're joining this tradition that takes us all the way back to Moshe. And even though we're not talking about Moshe at all, and there's no illustrated pictures of baby Moses on the river, well, in adult Haggadahs, at any rate, even though we don't talk about Moshe, Moshe is present in everything we do, because we are living out the tradition he started in Deuteronomy 1. And I want to finish with that, and I want to finish with a beautiful way to look at it that, again, is taken from Aviva Gottlieb Zarenberg's book, The Particulars of Raptures, in box 12 in the source sheet. The political liberation of the Exodus is thus realized most intimately in the narratives that will convey the idiosyncratic otherness of the subject, its strangers. Okay, this is a heavy sentence. I'll unpack it a little bit. She's saying that in the Exodus, we became politically free, physically free, and free as a nation. But how do we actually experience this freedom today? We experience it by telling the story. Because every time we tell the story, we tell our own versions. As we said in the beginning, stories are subjective, circumstantial. They have a point of view. They come from a particular perspective. They happen in a particular moment in time and within a particular relationship. I suspect that the way we discuss the story this year, when it's just us and my kids, is going to be very different than we discuss it with our adult relatives and friends and guests in other years, more healthy years. The story is always unique. And there's always many versions of it. And when Moshe and following him, the Haggadah, release us to tell our own story, they're giving us a taste of liberation, just as the Israelites tasted liberation in that night in Exodus. And then she goes on and says, these narratives of the night are to be told between father and son. In this generative, performative narrative, the father does not possess the truth. It's not that the father saw the miracles and he's describing them, but he still speaks in the first person because he is creating, he is generating the experience of going through slavery and redemption as he tells the story. And therefore, since he is, and that's my words now, therefore, since he is creating this experience for himself as he tells the story, it becomes a testimony to liberation. It becomes a testimony to what it means to go through these things. In Aviva Zorenberg's words, but yet, which is unwittingly testimonial to a truth that is not entirely available to its own speakers. These unwitting testimonies will vary, of course, with the teller and with the listener. Each of us is creating our own version. Each of us is following in Moshe's footsteps on our own, and somehow the very uniqueness of these versions, the very fact that they're our own, makes what we experience through them connect us not merely to our own personal circumstances, but somehow by going into ourselves and telling the story in ourselves from the kishkas of our life and our experience and what it means to us, we become connected to each other. Perhaps a little bit like this conversation right now, where all of us are sitting separately, but somehow through our shared experience of being in isolation, we're also sharing something large and beautiful together. And with that, I want to wish you all a very happy, a very meaningful, and God willing, healthy Passover to you and to all of yours. And may we continue telling stories that will make us feel together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
going
you
to
so much.
remind you to tell us about the bathroom. Moshe in the bathroom.
What? Oh yeah, Moshe in the bathroom. Right. Thank you. So my son is in Sarah Salzberg's playgroup, which I'm sure many of you know and know how wonderful it is. And the second the playgroup had to close, Saras and Malka prepared arts and crafts projects for the kids to do at home and distributed them amongst us. And the kids made a little Moshe B'Teva to play with in the bath. So Danny's Moshe B'Teva is in the bath. And this morning when I was talking to the older kids and I said, but where is Moshe in the Haggadah? Danny raised his eyes and said, oh, he's on the bathroom. That's where Moshe is.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. That was really wonderful. We're recording this class, as you know, so if you have any friends who would like to watch it, if you would like to watch it again, Mayan will be posting it on our website. Also, we are, it's a day-by-day thing right now. I think we're all feeling that. So we're working on more classes, more online classes. One class that we know of for sure is Rachel will be teaching again for us. We've been doing for the last 2 years a meeting of the 929 program, well, our own version, which is following a parak a day of Tanakh. So Rachel is going to be giving that class. Normally it's in the morning, but because of just everyone's schedule, it'll be in the evening, also at 8:15 on Tuesday, March 31st. So even if you haven't joined us for any of those other classes, I highly, highly recommend you join us for that class. And we had an anonymous sponsor for this class, which is why we were able to offer it for free. So if anyone would be interested in sponsoring a future class next week, hopefully we'll be done with this, but kind of not looking like that. We'll be continuing to offer classes over the coming weeks, God willing, as long as we're here. So if anyone's looking for a sponsorship opportunity in honor or in memory of someone, please get in touch with me and we can create a class, or you can sponsor one of the ones we have. Also, just keep it on your schedule. Probably Monday and Wednesday. Monday we are probably going to have a class which will be in Hebrew with Moria, Dr. Moria Ron Ben Chai, I think is her name. So she's here doing a fellowship, I think, at Brandeis. So she'll probably be giving something. We're just working out the final details. And same thing, Rachel Slutsky, who's given classes for us before, will be giving another pre-Pesach class on Wednesday evening next week. Also, kind of TBD, so keep your eyes out for the email. We'll probably be sending an email out Sunday just to let you know what's coming up with the week. And if anyone has any questions or, of course, would like to sponsor, email me, director@mayan.org. And thank you so much. Wishing everyone a Chag Kasher, Sameach, and healthy for the Pesach. Yeah.
Hi, it's Lynn. Rachel, you asked the question why he's starting after Ma'amad Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first point where, right after Ma'amad Sinai is Maseh Ha'egel. Vayara Amki Boshesh Moshe. Moshe's gone. So what Moses is trying to do now in Deuteronomy, I'm going to be gone again, but this time I want to prepare you.
That's beautiful.
I want to prevent you from having something like Maseh Ha'egel again.
That's
So
really beautiful.
He wants to make sure that in his absence, he can prepare them to live in his likeness, live with him inside of them to guide them this time.
That's really beautiful, and it also goes well with Andrea's healing, with Andrea's point about healing the rapture between the generations that left Egypt and got to Israel. He's trying to recreate a story that heals and kind of answers the questions that caused the problems before, perhaps, and avoids making the same mistake. This is really beautiful. I never thought of it this way. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this thought.
Yasher kochech.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night. Pesach Sameach.
Thank you. Rachel. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
It's nice to see all these